Okay, brachiopods, my very most favorite. So let's do a little bit of brachiopod basics, and then we'll go into a little more detail, and then we'll go into functional morphology. We got a whole bunch of brachiopod stuff lined up, and mostly that's because we have so many brachiopods in the teaching collection, and so it's a thing that we have a lot of, and we can do some different studies with these than we can do with some of the other things where we only have like one specimen. We can each look at it, but yeah, can't really compare and contrast and look over time in those cases. So brachiopods, they kind of look like butterflies, at least the good ones. They tend to have, we call these parts the wings on the side, so just like a little butterfly. And we call this sometimes the nose in the center. So yeah, there you go, a little nose in the center. But a brachiopod is not a butterfly, of course. This is a very short worm with an elaborate feeding apparatus, and it happens to have a shell on the outside. A brachiopod looks more like a Pac-Man, but you have to imagine a Pac-Man with a tail. So a brachiopod is going to open, and if we can find the side that opens, then we know that the back of that's going to be the hinge. So the hinge is at the posterior, just like on a Pac-Man. And the anterior, which means front, is going to be the part that opens. Yeah, waka, 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 just like that. The little tail part here is going to be a thing called a pedicle. And you can see that right over here. There's a pedicle coming out of a modern brachiopod. So here's the anterior, here's the posterior, and think of it as a tail, and the tail comes out the back. So you know that's the posterior. All right. And then if you're looking down on this thing, you'll have the dorsal and the ventral sides. I'll show you how to recognize those here in a minute. A lot of people will illustrate their brachiopods. We have a nice little spinning brachiopod mascot up here. I think it looks pretty cool. I believe that is an orchid. I think that's a platystrophia. Yeah. But it's one that looks like a spirifer. Yeah, so that's the one that fools you. And it's probably on the way to becoming something like that, or else convergent evolution. If you show your brachiopod like this, that is where the hinge is. This is the opening, so it's like that. Which means that that's the posterior. You've hung the posterior in the air, and why would you do a thing like that? It's just weird. Yeah, it's not how they are in life. Yeah. So the two valves of these things, you can call them the brachial valve and the pedicle valve, or you can call this the ventral valve, and that's the more common modern term. So the ventral valve will often have like an overbite. It'll come over top, and the ventral valve is going to have a little hole in it, and that's where the pedicle comes out. That's the most common arrangement. So there you go. In order to identify a brachiopod, you really need 7 different views. You need the top, bottom, side, front, back, and you need the 2 insides of those 2, and then it helps to have some sort of tilted insides. There are things you can only see that are kind of on the edge. Like if it's just on this edge right here, you might want to tilt it 45 degrees in order to see what's going on up there. Yeah. This is life orientation. So in life orientation, when they're alive, we think mostly brachiopods have their ventral down and their dorsal up. Dorsal means back. So imagine these things as just laying face down in the mud. Like their front, their ventral, is going to be in the mud, and their back is going to be up on the surface. Yeah, sticking out of the mud. Quick way to orient your brachiopod. If you look at the back of your brachiopod, just look at the center of it, and if it looks like a smile, then it's upside down. Because brachiopods don't do that. Brachiopods frown like that in the center. Just pay attention to the center. Yeah. If you have it like this, then you can say, okay, I've got this. And so this side would be the ventral, and this would be the dorsal up here. Yeah, ventral, dorsal. And we are looking at the anterior, because that's the side that opens. Yeah. Right? Easy. Yeah. So unhappy little Pac-Man laying face down in the mud, that's a brachiopod. That's their deal. And if these weren't such charismatic little fossils, and if they weren't so common just about everywhere that has marine fossil rocks, we might not be talking about them. But we are, because they are. They are fantastic. They're magnificent. Brachiopods go through a development that has several metamorphoses in there. So you'll have a little larva, and it's going to have these little setae, these little sort of sensory bristles on the outside, and little bands of cilia potentially running around it, which are both for eating and for water flow. And so as it eats, it's going to generate a current, which is actually going to move it along. Then it's going to metamorphose, and it's going to start to develop tentacles up here, and these are going to have the little cilia are going to end up there. And it's going to start to develop a little tiny shell called the protegulum because it protects. And that's Latin for protecting. And so that's the very first little shell. It'll probably start out as chitin, but there are some brachiopods where it actually has a different mineral composition in the early shell than it does in the later shell. So they'll actually go through different shell mineral types as they evolve, as they develop. Yeah, not evolve. And so, or sometimes they're calling it the embryonic shell. And then the next shell that they make called the neanic shell. And then the brephic shell is the next shell they make. There's names for each of these little growth stages. But you'll see little rises in the shell. And those are generally going to be where some of the body parts are. This one at the back, that's going to cover like the brachiopod itself, like its stomach, its rudimentary nervous system, kidneys, stuff like that. It keeps it underneath the armoring. And then things like the tentacles are there for grabbing food, and so those need to be out closer to the edge. And then you'll have muscles. Once you have a shell, you need muscles so you can open the shell and then close the shell at the first sign of danger. And they do, yeah. Here are some of the most primitive brachiopods. Very, very early Cambrian brachiopods. And you can see there are similarities, but also some real differences in these shells. You can start to recognize different ones. But all of these, so these are oriented with the posterior up at the top. That's where the mouth of the brachiopod would be. And then around here is where the feeding arms are going to be. They're all going to be inside that shell. There's one group of brachiopods called craniids, Craniids, and they essentially look like this sort of pattern, even when they are full-on adults. So they are very similar to an early stage that just never grew up. They're like a little Peter Pan taxon. When that happens in evolution, it's called pedomorphy, Pedomorphy, which means you look like a baby forever. Like humans are pedomorphic apes. We retain that babyish complexion relative to something like a chimpanzee. We continue developing. Our early development goes on longer. They are mature and ready to have their own babies way before our babies are anywhere near mature enough to do that. Before our babies can walk, I think they can have babies. Those are the differences. Inside those shells, you have little scars, and there's little bumps here. They're marking on the shell, and some of these bumps are going to be little scars from where the sensory tentacles would stick out. So they're called setae, S-E-T-A-E. At the posterior, in many brachiopod types, you're going to have a hole. So see this round hole right there? And that's going to be where the pedicle used to come out. So they call that a foramen. Like the kind of a hole in the skull that babies have where it's sort of rubbery in the center. That's a foramen. Yeah, and it just means an opening, basically, in the hard part. And so, that's the pedicle foramen of the shell, which is located right at the posterior center of brachiopods. And remember our valves? It's the ventral valve that has the hole where the pedicle comes out in most brachiopods. The other orientation is it'll come out in between the two shells in a couple of them, but forget about those. Those are the lingulids. We don't need to worry about those right now. Go for the general rule. And then from the earliest growth, you can see that these things underwent metamorphosis. But because they preserve their earliest parts in their shell and they remain essentially unaltered, they just sort of grow over the top of them. They keep growing. You can say, oh, this thing used to have really sharp folds and little wings early in development, and then they just sort of flatten out into this big, smooth brachiopod later on. Or they had a little tiny bump, which was baby's first shell, and here's the second layer shell. It sort of grew up to a little point, and then it changed genetics again and just started laying down regular shell from there on out. But they preserve their early growth characters in the different little bands, and you find all of those at the posterior because brachiopods grow from posterior toward the anterior. Yeah, yeah. And they just keep growing anteriorward as they grow, basically. All right, here are some of the metamorphoses that a little baby brachiopod goes through in its early life. So they're going to start out something like this. You'll have little bristles, and you're also going to have your little cilia on here to catch some food and move us around. And then the first metamorphosis they go through is to fold these parts that are down around the top. So this part and this part are going to fold up, and they're going to become the mantle. The mantle is eventually going to secrete the two shells. So these parts, once they have reformed, are going to start to secrete the original shells. This part with all the cilia on it and the setae, this part is going to metamorphose into the tentacles so it can do feeding. And so that's got a long way to go. And then this little black thing here is the mouth. And so the tentacles are going to connect us up to the mouth. Or maybe it's this little pit, number 7 right there. Here's just looking in, if you were looking in from the top of this thing, that's roughly what it would look like. Then, in later development, Brachiopod is going to develop a lophophore, L-O-P-H-O-P-H-O-R-E, lophophore. That's our fancy name for the tentacles. And so these tentacles are going to be usually in this shape, and they're going to have smaller tentacles coming off them. The smaller tentacles are going to have cilia coming off them, which will generate water flow, and are going to catch food on the collars of those cells, just like on a little coenoflagellate. Yeah. So the actual brachiopod animal is just clustered right here at the back. It's this thing. This is why I say it's like a really short worm. Because this is the shell length from here to here, and this is the actual animal. And it's got this elaborate feeding apparatus, which are these two long feeding arms that are going to be coming up here that look like they're touching in the center there, but they're actually more like this. And so these are going to catch food, and they're going to pass it along to the mouth, and then inside the mouth there's going to be digestive organs, and so it'll actually digest the food. So they're going to be filter feeders that generate a current and then filter from it. The tentacles themselves are not muscular usually, but they are hollow, and they can be filled up and they can be sort of drained, and they'll sort of collapse like that. And so when the brachiopod needs to close itself down, it can deflate its tentacles, and it can essentially be paper thin and very flat, and it's fine because it can just reinflate when it's ready to open back up and start feeding again. So yeah, it's the beauty of having a sort of a hydraulic structure. Yeah, inflatable. And here are some modern brachiopods. Here you can see we're looking at the posteriors are all down here at the bottom. And you've got great big lovely tentacles with smaller tentacles coming from them. And they're wrapped around, and they are converging on a mouth, which is going to be in the center of this. And then the digestive organs are going to be back here, as well as the kidneys for filtering out waste from there. And the gonads are going to tend to be kind of off to the side, or sometimes in here. Although usually on the bottom, that's additional digestive components. It's like an intestine that's spread out. Looks like fingers is the most common arrangement. All right. Here is the rare case of a brachiopod with soft tissue preservation. So this is an ancient Silurian brachiopod, if you remember your geological time scale. So this is Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, pretty early, but before the Devonian. Yeah. And you can see inside of it, this is one of those that they actually sectioned. They did serial sectioning, ground it down, took photos at each level, reconstructed it in 3 dimensions. It looks gorgeous because they did a ton of these little sections. And you've got little traces in there of the lophophore. Remember, the lophophore is the feeding tentacles. And so you can see the arrangement of these feeding tentacles, which is pretty cool. And you can also see the pedicle. Look at that. It's got a big kind of meaty pedicle with little fingers at the bottom of it. Yeah, nobody was particularly expecting that. And this is a type of brachiopod. This entire very large group have gone extinct. So this is something that we would not have known without this particular fossil. And this particular fossil does not exist anymore because it was ground layer by layer in order to generate these images. So the images are now the type specimen for this particular brachiopod, which is its own thing. New genus, new species, Bethia serraticulma. All right. Inside brachiopods, in their skeleton, you can sometimes see traces of the different structure of the feeding arms, the different structure of the lophophores. So look, this one has little arms that would have held the lophophore up, sort of keep it away from the organs on the bottom. And it would have big muscles here to close the shell mostly. Here you can see one where there's actual, like a little ridge where we think the lophophore would sit. And so you can see kind of the shape that the lophophore would take. And you've got, so this would draw in water from the center and then fan it out over these feeding lophophores, and then would come out the side. And you'll have little, they call them baffles, like a little wall to redirect water flow in there. And sometimes little spines to create turbulence in the water flow of these things. And yeah, you can see a lot of different arrangements. I think the coolest one are in spirifers. So this is a spirifer, a gypospirifer, and you can see it's got this little coiled up structure, and that is the support for the lophophore. So the fancy name for that is a brachiophore, but whatever. If you can get lophophore in your head, I'll take that for now. And so this is the lophophore support, you could say. But in spirifers, yeah, so the lophophore curled around and just went all the way out to the edge. Now that's a lot of lophophore packed into a small space, which means these things are greedy little feeding specialists. They could generate a ton of water flow, and they could pick out a ton of nutrients, which meant they probably grew really fast, which they did, and got really big, which they sometimes did. Yeah, yeah. The little hooks that'll sometimes hold the feeding arms up are going to be called crura. And so that's these little things right there, if you're interested. All right. So let's look at brachiopod shells. So this is from the genome of Lingula. And what we can see here, all of these are all the proteins that you would need to make bones in a human, or bones like to lay down the shell of a mollusk. And what you can see here, yeah, you've got things that are, everything in green is similar between bones and mollusks and brachiopods, Lingula brachiopod. And so it's basically the same process. Building shells is kind of building bones. Lingula, specifically, is going to be part of a group that uses calcium phosphate, which is the same mineral that we have in our bones. And it's going to use that to make its shell. It'll lay down a bit of chitin, and then it'll lay down some calcium phosphate on top of that, and that will be its shell. Yeah. And so there are only a few of these proteins, which are kind of regulating calcium for the most part, that you would find only in the human version of bones. But basically, this is a conserved system. The way that animals make hard parts is fairly well conserved. It appears to come back from a single point of origin. And that origin might be in the Cnidaria. It may be that all these things are actually related to primitive Cnidaria, or I guess a smarter way to say it would be it goes back to the crown group. And so brachiopods and mollusks and things like people come from the same crown group. And you can tell that because we have the same genes. We have the same genetic inheritance. Yeah. And we do the same, slightly different thing, but mostly the same thing in roughly the same way. Yeah. All right. Compared to some of its relatives, so very close to brachiopods are these things called bryozoa. And they're like a colonial brachiopods. They're like a bunch of itty-bitty little brachiopods that all live together right next to each other, and they're genetically related to each other. They're like little clones of each other for the most part. And yeah, this is looking at some of their developmental genes and regulatory genes. And so they share a common set in this particular group. These are going to be genes that are distinctive for brachiopods, but they also have a lot of genes that are going to be very similar to what you would find in humans. So they'll have things, I believe, like parahox and hox genes. And hox genes are like what gives you your fingers. Like if you express extra hox genes somewhere, you'll have an extra finger coming out. stuff like that. They are developmental patterning gene sets. And yeah, these are some of the ones that are specific to brachiopods. So there you go. The brachiopod shell, going back to the very earliest brachiopods, has this column and lamina structure. So you have these little hollow tubes that come out, and that's probably a bit of the mantle of the brachiopod is actually sticking out through that hole to hold on to whatever is on the other side. But you'll have columns that separate out these little layers, and the little layers will be there to essentially keep the water on the outside to control that. And so, yeah, it's a nice sort of spongy shell structure that is filled in more modern brachiopods. But yeah, not in these particular ones. Okay, and like it says at the bottom, maybe that's a good place to pause. So we'll break up the brachiopods into 3 parts, and this is the end of the first part of brachiopods. So see you for part 2.